Welcome to Unraveling Behavior, a science podcast from the Max Planck Institute for Human Development. Hi, everyone. When we talk about adolescents taking risks, it's usually all about them acting on impulse and having underdeveloped brains. But there is more to the story. Today, we'll dive into how the environments adolescents grow up in shape their behavior. Dr. Simon Cyranka, a cognitive scientist at our institute, is here to share his insights. We'll explore how personal experience and social norms influence adolescent risk-taking and what this means for public policy. So, buckle up, everyone. It's going to be a safe but really interesting ride. Simon, thank you so much for joining us today. It's truly an honor to have you on the podcast.
Hi, Sophia. Yeah, it's nice being here. Thanks for having me.
Many people link adolescents' tendency to take risks to the fact that their brains are not yet fully developed. What changes are happening in the brain at this stage of development that may contribute to risk-taking?
The easiest or the most encompassing definition of risky behavior is you do something where something rewarding, something good could be happening, or something bad with some probability, and you don't really know if it's gonna happen or not. What's most pronounced and most relevant for risky behaviors is that there's something like an incentive or reward processing brain region that is already kind of fully mature.
Can you define reward?
Yeah, reward is basically everything that feels good. It's like one of the main motivators of any kind of behavior is making rewarding experiences, being told that something is being good, something that feels like, okay, I want to do that again. It's basically, a reward could be the gummy bears that you have in your desk drawer when you are doing something that's really complicated or difficult to concentrate. You would put a little reward once in a while in between the complicated task that you're doing to keep you engaged.
And can it also be, for instance, a good feeling?
Yeah. That's I guess what it is.
Or the approval of other people, can that also be a reward?
That also feels good. There are some researchers who say that this reward processing is really at the base of forming any kind of behavior. So it doesn't necessarily need to feel good. It's already the anticipation that something will feel good. It's basically making a prediction about something that is going to feel good. That's being processed by these reward processing brain regions. And there are other brain regions that are responsible for projecting ourselves into the future, for controlling our impulses. And these usually take a little bit longer. So what people think drives maybe a propensity for young people to take more risks than older people is that they are kind of in the situation where there's some imbalance between reward processing brain regions that are already almost functionally at adult levels and impulse control, cognitive control that still takes up until the 20s to mature.
Right. So do you say that there is an imbalance, right, between the parts of the brain that are sensitive to these rewards and the parts of the brain that are responsible for thinking about consequences, right, and impulses?
Exactly. So, or for controlling our impulses. It's, I think, more specific. And yeah, that leads some researchers or some people to say that adolescents are kind of in the situation where they like having to drive a car, where the gas pedal is basically already full on, but the brakes don't work that well. I think it's a really nice metaphor to understand how these opposing brain regions, how these different brain regions influence behavior in that age.
And what are the names of these brain regions?
The most relevant for reward processing is regions, the nucleus accumbens. It's like somewhere like deep in the brain, really, really evolutionary, very old brain region, because it is so relevant for forming behavior. Impulse control brain regions, these are like prefrontal cortex, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It's like right in front of our forehead. It's like before the front. So really like that. And with brain development, you can really think that the stuff that is evolutionarily older, that's also the stuff that develops earlier. And these prefrontal brain regions, they kind of they evolved much later than those reward processing brain regions. And therefore also during human development, they take longer to
mid-20s,
fully
you were
mature.
saying.
Mid-20s is what they say, yeah.
Some research suggests that adolescent risk-taking isn't just about brain imbalances. What findings challenge this idea?
If it were only about these brain imbalances, we would expect a particular timing. So we would expect risky behavior to peak during the time where this imbalance is the greatest. That's usually between 14 and 16 years old, where people find a lot of activity in the reward processing brain regions that's not being matched up with brain activity in the prefrontal brain regions. But that's not where we usually would find where people are taking most risks. So risk takers, or the biggest risk takers nowadays in Western society, seem to be college students when they are in their early 20s, where a lot of this maturational imbalance should have already been leveling out. So there needs to be another explanation for risky behavior.
And in the case of college students, what sort of actions are we talking about? Is it really like dangerous driving? Are we talking about drinking?
The things that come to mind. So it's when we are talking about risky behavior in the real world, examples that are being often used is unprotected sexual relationships, binge drinking, or substance abuse is another thing, yes. And more generally, thrill-seeking behaviors, to which risky driving counts, but also in some of the assessments, riding the bicycle without a helmet would also be considered a risky behavior. So it's a very broad range.
And when scientists do studies on risk-taking behavior in the lab, do they find also that this is the group that takes more risk in the lab?
In the laboratory, right? There, what you would actually find is that the youngest people, so maybe even younger than where this imbalance that we've been talking about previously occurs. So in the samples that we've been collecting, we had a definition of like childhood that was before 12 years old, mostly, so 8 to 12 years old. And there, the youngest, so the 8-year-old, would also be the ones who are taking the most risks. Anyway, so that doesn't really add up to this peak, to this extreme risk-taking that is often assumed to occur during adolescence.
Do scientists know what kinds of factors might explain the differing conclusions between, studies that look into real-world behaviors and studies that look at risk-taking in the lab?
Yeah, one explanation that I really like is because it lets you think about what it is that you are actually measuring in the laboratory, is that experience is different between different age groups. So, and the opportunities to take risks, they differ in different age groups. So for young people, for adolescents, they usually have a time where they are supposed to be back home. They usually have teachers and parents who are looking out for them. So the opportunities to engage in crazy, risky behaviors, they are much more limited than they are for young adults, where they don't have these societal barriers. So that is one thing. And in an experiment, you put everybody into the same situation. You give everybody the same task. Everybody has the same constraints for behavior. So it's basically the environment is the same for everyone. So somehow this risky behavior that we are interested in young people, maybe something that's got something to do first with this tendency, maybe that may be there, that maturational imbalance in the brain, but also got something to do with the environments that individuals are in and people are growing up in. And these environments change across development. So the environment that a 10-year-old lives in, of course, is really different from the one that a 14-year-old lives in. And that's really different from the one that we live in as people who are older.
And I think this provides a very, very good transition point to an article that you published in 2023 with Ralph Hertwig in the journal Trends in Cognitive Sciences. And in this paper, you argue that people's willingness to take risks as they grow isn't just about brain imbalances, that it's also about how they interact with their environments. You identify in this article 2 environmental factors that might lead to greater risk-taking. And one of them, as you're just saying, is greater opportunities to take risk. Can you explain how this works in the real world?
So in this article, we use an example of driving, and I think we also use an example of binge drinking behavior, because these are things where opportunities are different in different countries. And we can basically use this to ask the question of how much does the environment actually influence our conclusions about age trends in risky behavior, right? So for instance, in risky driving in Germany, people are allowed to drive when they are 18. In other countries, people are allowed to drive when they are 16 and sometimes even earlier. So what you can do is you can look at accidents as a manifestation of risky driving behavior and can see how the accident statistics are different in different age groups. And there it becomes really, really clear that as soon as young people are novices, so adolescents do something for the first time, they have little experience, they get the opportunity to engage in a risky behavior, then these accidents happen more often. So that's basically, we have an outcome, we see the outcome of a risky behavior as an accident, and then we can look at how often accidents happen. What you can also do is you can look at the behavior directly. That, for instance, is with alcohol consumption. There are similar regulations in different countries. So in Germany, young people are allowed to drink when they are 16. In other countries, they are allowed to drink when they are 18. And in other countries, they are allowed to drink when they are 21. And you can look at the amount of alcohol that's being consumed by these people. And you can see that as soon as people start to reach that legal drinking age, their alcohol consumption goes up. And it doesn't matter if you're 16 or if you're 18 or if you're 21. On average, it goes up. And that's an example for the opportunities to engage in risky behavior in these environments, and also an example for how societal guardrails, regulations shape what we can actually see about risky behavior in the real world.
Another way that the environment shapes risk-taking is through the so-called law of effect, right? What exactly is the law of effect, and how does it influence our behavior?
The principle of conditioning and the principle of the law of effect is what we've been talking about before, right? So if something feels good, or if something leads to a rewarding experiences, if my behavior has an effect on the world that I like, I will do it again. And so that can generate very complex reward-seeking behaviors from a very simple principle of, if I do something that's nice, I will do it again.
And negative experiences would increase caution.
They would increase caution. That is the hot stove effect. So psychologists like to have funny names for the effects. The hot stove is like the cat who is sitting on the hot stove for the first time and then realizes, oh, this hurts. And then the cat starts to avoid the hot stove. Same law of effect here.
Examples could be like having, for instance, a car accident.
Yeah, exactly. So negative experiences that follow if we are talking about the risky behavior, negative experiences that follow your risky behavior. I, for instance, go onto a party and I stay longer than I'm supposed to. I'm drunk and then I can't get home anymore. And that's a very negative experience. So I don't do it again.
In this paper, you also discuss how learning about risks through personal experience, in this way, right, through direct experience, can sometimes create a false sense of security. How does that work?
Yeah. This is the part about statistics in an environment. So if we think about an environment, we need to describe some way of how the environment itself interacts with an individual. When we say environments and opportunities and everything is important, then we need to figure out something where there's this interface between environment and individual. And there, these statistics really come into play. So that is basically, if I'm on this party, for instance, and I'm engaging in binge drinking behavior, and then I don't know what kind of consequences will happen, but there's some likelihood that some good things will happen, and there's some likelihood that some bad things will happen. And for instance, there's a probability of 10% that I'm not gonna get home, but maybe there's a probability of 50% that I'm gonna find my crush at the party or somebody else at the party who is really cool and I feel connected to them. And so with these experiences, the bad stuff that could happen, it's kind of more rare, more unlikely than the good things that happen. And if you can imagine it even more abstractly, right? If you want to get have a rewarding experience in a lottery, for instance, because that's how we would usually think about the outcomes of risk taking. It's something that's probabilistic, so something that could occur but doesn't have to occur. And the simplest example of this is a lottery. If you think about this, imagine I have a bag of marbles, and there are 20 marbles inside. Like 19 of them are blue and 1 of them is red. So red, for instance, is the bad experience. Say, if you draw the red marble, you have to give me 20 euros or something like that. I don't know. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or give me 50. If you draw a blue marble, I give you 1. You don't really know what the distribution of red and blue marbles are. I'm just giving you that bag, basically, the bag of consequences of your behavior, the consequences of drawing. You sample 1 marble, you get a blue one. You're happy. And you think, oh yeah, this is really nice. You do it another time. And you do it another time. You do it another time. And
it's always blue.
And it's always blue. Exactly. Yeah. So the statistics, the distribution of your experiences, that's highly skewed towards the positive experiences. It's highly skewed towards not realizing how bad it would be to draw the 1 red marble.
Except that one day you might do get the red one. It just might take you a few attempts.
And the problem is, if you don't really know how many red and how many blue marbles are in that thing, how the hell are you gonna know? So it's only experience that can tell you. And there, this law of effect becomes really important for shaping our future behavior. So if I'm making this experience say, you know what, nothing really bad could happen. I know that they say there's some red marble in there somewhere, but maybe it's not for me. Maybe I'm not gonna get it. I've been getting it 100 times. I haven't been getting it 100 times before, so I'm gonna do it again.
So what you're saying, if I understand you correctly, is that since really bad, severe harms are rare.
Oftentimes with these risky behaviors.
Oftentimes rare. Yeah. Adolescents get to often enjoy the rewards from risky behaviors without really realizing the dangers, right? Without experiencing a bad outcome. Yes. And with that, they come to a situation where they underestimate the risk.
That could happen, yeah. I think particularly insidious is substance use, like drinking alcohol or other drug use that kind of feels good in the first place, but comes with really bad consequences down the line. It's another example that we have in the paper.
Cumulative risks.
Cumulative risks, right? So like in the beginning, when you're drinking 1 or 2 beers at one party, that probably doesn't make too much of a difference, but it already, if you then submise to this law of effect and keep on doing that more often, at some point you will experience bad outcomes. Or having unprotected sex one time, there's actually a higher chance to get lucky and not get any sexual transmitted diseases and not get an unwanted pregnancy But as soon as you do it more often, the probability of making that bad experience almost becomes a certainty. The issue is that initially, for most of these behaviors that we are interested in, it's actually really unlikely that something bad will happen. And that can be a vicious circle of risky behavior.
Some of our audience might be wondering, okay, so if severe harms are rare, why should we be concerned?
Yeah, because they are only rare for the small window of experience that you have. But as I said before, at some point, if you keep on engaging in risky behaviors such as like risky driving, risky sexual encounters, drug abuse, at some point the bad consequences will occur, and they are oftentimes really, really severe. The problem is that it's just a matter of individual experiences somehow. And if the probability of making good experiences outweighs the probability of making bad experiences in the very beginning, then this can lead to, well, a solidification of these risky behaviors. And with substance abuse, there's a whole other thing with that this stuff is tampering with our brain chemistry and altering our biology in a way that makes us depend, like literally depend on these substances, which makes it even harder to do. So then at some point, it's also not a question about risky behavior anymore, but about substance dependency, which is qualitatively very different. And that is also one of the risks that this whole law of effect thing is imposing on young people now.
What I was also thinking is that the severity of the risk might also play a role, right? The severity of how bad the consequences could possibly be.
Yeah.
Because when we talk about risk, we should consider the probability of the bad consequence happening, right? This is what we have considered so far in our conversation, but also how damaging or how impactful the outcome could be. And if we are talking about life-changing consequences, right, permanent changes to our lives, then even a rare harm can actually represent a big risk.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like if you incur the risk of, say, a permanent disability from a certain behavior.
Which is basically what a substance addiction can be. Yeah.
Right. Well, at this point, I think we should perhaps go back to the beginning of our conversation. We talked about the brain imbalances that are observed during this stage of development. And I would like to ask, how does the rarity of risks in the environment or their delayed nature interacts with these brain development dynamics that you explained earlier?
There's this one thing. There's this imbalance of reward processing. Doesn't necessarily have to mean that young people are totally crazy, but in combination with an environment that facilitates rewarding experiences for stuff where there could be really bad consequences as well. These two things can really produce very maladaptive behaviors in a way.
If the brain development dynamics, in combination with these environmental conditions, create a situation where adolescents are likely to underestimate risks, you could ask, why did evolution, shape humans in this way?
It seems paradox, right?
Yes.
So like, why not?
Why?
Yeah. The thing is, different developmental stages come with different milestones. For young children or like for toddlers, it is saying the first words or being able to walk or whatever. So there are things that need to happen for them to beneficially thrive, grow up in a way. And the developmental task of youth is to become an adult, to gain an adult's role in society, somehow develop their own identity in a way. and that's important, be independent from their parents. So they somehow need to be able to lead a sustainable life. And that doesn't work if you never dare to leave the nest. I like to use the example of a penguin. So there's a great book, tells a story about a penguin named Ursula, who grows up in South Georgia. And at some point, without never having done that before, this penguin just leaves the nest of the parents, jumps into the Arctic Sea, swims around there for like 16 days, and there are seals and whales and everything that wants to eat them. And then that penguin comes back. And during that time, they learned to avoid predators. They learned to be mindful about the dangers that are around there. But that only happens through that experience, through that being able to dare to leave this nest. So somehow these neurodevelopmental changes, they could potentially give young individuals, in not only in humans, but also in other species, even in birds like penguins, give the courage to make these really important experiences that they can then exploit when they are adults, and be able to really know who they are, what they want, and how they should lead their lives.
This also connects well to our previous podcast episode with Tomás Lejarraga. His research also shows that risk-taking is also a way of younger siblings to differentiate themselves from their older siblings in order to get parental attention and parental resources.
Yeah, so risk-taking isn't necessarily a bad thing. And it even seems that for adolescents, for human adolescents, being able to have the opportunity to take some risks, that can also be academic risks, or can be like doing some sports or something like this, or exploring their own identity in a way. Yeah, that's related to their mental health. So if young people don't have these opportunities, if they don't engage in risks, then they are not feeling great. So not allowing them to do anything at all would not be the solution for sure, because they somehow need to do that. We as a society need to find a way to enable and give young people these valuable, formative experiences and opportunities to make them themselves, while at the same time striking a balance and helping them to avoid the craziest pitfalls or the worst pitfalls of risky behaviors. It's a really tough task.
What are the implications for how risk warnings should be delivered to adolescents? Like, I'm thinking risk warnings about, substance abuse or sexual health.
I mean, this is the easiest intervention that we can make as a society, right? We can tell young people, this is not good, don't do it. The problem with this law of effect thing is that when you already make the experience that something feels really good, then these warnings, these descriptions of all the bad things that could happen, they don't work so well, because then it's basically description of harm that you can't really envision, that contrasts with your personal rich experience of the reward.
There's some sort of a disconnect, right, between what they read and what they experience.
Exactly. And we want to avoid this disconnect. If we give these warnings before people make these experiences. So there are studies. There's one study I remember from Ethiopia where they educated about condom use, and the condom use was more adopted by people who had never made any sexual experiences before. Or there was a campaign that was actually not unsuccessful when in my youth in German schools, it's keine Macht den Drogen. Don't give drugs the power, in a way. And these campaigns, they are most successful for people who haven't already engaged in these behaviors themselves. The same was for condom use in the AIDS epidemic back in the 80s, where there was a call by the US Surgeon General Assembly to educate young people for having safer sexual practices. And those also have been adopted more by people who haven't been engaging this. And age didn't really play a role. So it's really about being a novice in this behavior, being new to it. in a way. That makes a difference.
But, it's really unavoidable to talk about risk-taking in adolescence without talking about peers. Peer influence is often seen as a reason why adolescents take risks. But in this paper you wrote with Ralph Hertwig, you've argued that their influence can also be helpful.
I think a lot of times people think about peers as like a source of bad influence. And I think one of the earlier studies that I'm aware of who were investigating the neuroscientific base of this, they were saying that being around with people of the same peer group, they even make this maturational imbalance worse. So they like make reward processing even like more pronounced in young people. And I think that was a narrative that has been around for a very long time. But peers also have a very different component. Peers force to influence behavior because they set up what a social norm is. A social norm can be divided into different things. The first thing is, am I supposed to do this? And the other thing is, what is everybody else doing? If many people are engaging in some kind of behavior, in some kind of risky behavior, that gives you the opportunity of a vicarious experience. So basically, you, without having yourself jumping through all the hoops and looking at all the negative consequences of behavior, maybe it's enough to see how these consequences of that behavior play out in your peer group. So that is the vicarious experience that helps us to get an overview, an idea of what the consequences of my risky behavior could really be like. Knowing that one person who had this accident, knowing that one person who ended up in the hospital, knowing that person who got an STD. Yeah, so that's the force of vicarious experience, where other people can basically shape our idea of the statistics of our environment. They can help us to get a more holistic view of what's really out there and what's really at risk, without me having to just rely on that law of effect and just learn everything by myself.
And peers, I would say they also influence risk-taking through the approval that they give. Adolescents, they may engage in behaviors that they think are the social norm, right? That they're common among their peers just to get this approval. And in a paper you published in 2021 with Wouter van den Bos, right? So there you explore adolescents' sensitivity to these perceived social norms.
We're mostly interested in how often they think people in their surroundings, people they know in their social networks, how often they think others are engaging in this risky behavior. And then we looked at if this estimate of young people about their understanding of what a social norm for this risky behavior is.
The question is, I have it here, how many of your peers have engaged in this behavior?
Exactly, yeah. Good. Yes. Yeah, that's their understanding of the social norm. We then took this and tried to understand what is the relation of our participants' conception of the social norm to their own propensity to engage in risky behavior. And that was surprisingly stable, actually, across age groups. So when they believe the social norm is there for risky behavior, it increases people's probability to engage in the risky behavior. What's different, and that I found really, really exciting, what was different in age groups, or like in the age range between 15 and 18, or 14 and 18, I'm not exactly sure right now anymore, was that those young people, adolescents, reliably overestimated how likely or how often their peers would engage in this behavior.
And what did you observe concerning the tendency to recommend risky behaviors to others?
we don't think that adolescents or anybody for that matter is just a passive recipient of social information, but they also actively contribute to it. And so we also asked, would you tell your friends that's a good idea, or would you tell them you should do that? And there it seemed like they, maybe because they think that everybody's doing it again, would also contribute more to that norm by telling others, well, yeah, you should really go skiing, or you should really do that.
But then you have a bit somehow of a vicious cycle here, right? Because if adolescents overestimate the frequency of the risky behaviors among their peers, and they are more likely to recommend those behaviors. And in addition, they are also seeking the approval of those that recommend. Then this creates sort of a mechanism that spreads risky behaviors throughout the adolescent population.
Yeah, it can be, but it also can be can be an entry point of intervention. We estimate social norms. We don't know them. There's nobody telling us what a social norm is. We have to somehow figure it out for ourselves. And telling young people about true peer norms, that is really powerful. So basically adjusting people's understanding of the peer norms is an entry point for interventions that help us to maybe shape young people's behavior.
Well, Simon, as we come to a close, I want to sincerely thank you for taking the time to be here and share your insights. It was really an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast.
It was a pleasure for me as well. Thanks so much.
Dear audience, thanks for listening. Dr. Simon Cyranka explained how the environment influences adolescent risk-taking. Serious harm is often rare or delayed. So teens enjoy the rewards from risky behavior without experiencing bad consequences immediately. This can make them feel safer than they really are. That's why early warnings, before this sense of safety develops, can be more effective than stepping in later. We also learned that adolescents tend to overestimate the frequency of risky behaviors among their peers. This can make those behaviors seem normal and encourage more risk-taking. Teaching them the truth can help break this cycle. For more insights, check out the show notes on our website at unravelingbehavior.org. Thanks for tuning in and supporting science. Auf Wiedersehen.